Thanks, Ru. So Wei-Jun Cai is professor at University of Delaware now. He just moved, I believe, from the University of Georgia. He has worked on marine carbonate cycling for 20 years. His research interest includes calcium carbonate dissolution and sediment diagenesis in the deep sea. He's particularly interested to us because he's done an awful lot of work on CO2 air-sea exchange and carbon cycling within the coastal zone. So if you recall from our last talk, those of us who saw Joe Salisbury, we have recently transitioned this series of talks from looking at ocean acidification, sort of your class 1 condition in the open ocean, and we're now starting to look into the much more complex and nuanced situation that goes on within the coastal zone. So Wei-Jun, if you would please.
Thank you very much for helping me to get on this. We had several previous speakers and on this topic, including Eric Wang from Hui and Joe Salisbury and Rick Warnikoff. I'm sure there's some level of overlap, but that may not be a bad thing. So I will focus my talk on the acidification issue in estuarine and coastal ocean waters today. Now the first slides, you see the picture actually, a photo from Mississippi River plume, and the only that doesn't sound appropriate for the East Coast talk here. The only reason is I haven't got a nice photo of Chesapeake Bay, Mid-Atlantic bight yet, but I'm eager to get one. All right, today I will first briefly, after a brief introduction, I want to present a few examples of coastal ocean acidification and low oxygen events. Then I will discuss, based on first principles, what should be the responses of ocean and estuarine CO2 system, what should we expect to see. And finally, I will present some new results from the Delaware and Chesapeake Bay that we recently collected. All right? Okay. So first question is, what is ocean acidification in coastal water? What do I mean by that? Before I get to that question, I would like to briefly mention this biogeochemical background about the CO2 system in coastal ocean, particularly in estuarine. So we have a river input with high CO2, high nutrient, and a lot of organic matters. And usually river water has high CO2, very high value, some of them. So most river is a source of CO2 to the atmosphere. We release CO2 here. And because of the nutrient brought in by the river, usually in this mid-salinity zone, you have a very high biological production. So CO2 is taken into biomass and oxygen is produced. And that organic matter sinks out of the surface layer into the bottom water. And including both the surface and bottom water, there are oxygen decomposition. The organic matter is decomposed by using oxygen, and that generates CO2. And when oxygen is very low, usually in the sediment, you will have denitrification occurs that use fixed oxygen rather than free oxygen to decompose organic matter and produce CO2. In that case, you also consume acid. So the result is really a net bicarbonate production. So that impact is different from the oxygen respiration. All right, that's a brief introduction about the biogeochemical background. So back to this question, what do we mean by ocean acidification in coastal waters? So here I want to stick that strictly to Dick Feedy's definition, or that he would like. That's a global ocean uptake of atmospheric CO2, which we all know has resulted in a pH decrease about 0.1 pH unit. And then this source seawater with this already acidified source water with a high DIC to alkalinity ratio advect onshore and mixed with low salinity water. So that's one mechanism. You can bring this ocean acidification signal into coastal water and to the estuarine. On the other hand, we could have anthropogenic CO2 uptake locally due to this low CO2 in some system. Now I will discuss the difference of these two mechanisms of bringing CO2. But more importantly here is this water is further acidified by this respiration, that is organic matter decomposition, use oxygen, produce CO2, and of course modified by the denitrifications. We know that both this uptake of CO2 from anthropogenic CO2 will acidify seawater, and the decomposition of organic matter also brings in CO2 and acidifies seawater or coastal water here. So the question is, how do they interact? So that is what we are going to discuss today. I will first present a few published results about acidification in coastal oceans. So we will start with the west coast, U.S. west coast, and come back to the east coast. And this is this upwelling dominated system in the U.S. west coast, and then you can go up to the Bering Sea, and then come to this side to the St. Lawrence River, come down to Delaware Bay, Chesapeake Bay, Mid-Atlantic Bight, and to the Gulf of Mexico. So I will lead you through this quickly. And this one is, everyone is very familiar with that because Stick Feely's famous paper that in the west coast this upwelling brings low temperature, low oxygen, low pH, low saturation state, and high PCO2 and DIC water onto the shelf, and potentially have detrimental effect on biological system on shell-bearing organisms. And Dick further brings that into a study that you have this upwelling source water, and superimposed on that is this oxygen consumption in this Puget Sound. You have this local oxygen consumption that produce CO2, high CO2 and low pH water that's superimposed on the already low pH source water. So that is in the west coast, and actually, move up to the Bering Sea case. In this case, Jeremy Matthews' present is really largely driven by biological production in surface water, and that decomposition in the subsurface water reduces the saturation state greatly. And of course, this is also the end of the ocean conveyor belt, right? So the pH is already low, the pH and the saturation state of this water is already low. So now let's move to this side and start with St. Lawrence estuarine and the Gulf. This is a paper published by, a very nice one, published by Mucci and co-workers. So in the St. Lawrence estuarine bay, oxygen become very low in the last several decades, and you can see a very nicely correlated low pH zone, several one, and then there's a low carbonate. Now this doesn't look like exact same pattern as oxygen pH. That's because saturation state is mainly determined by carbonate, but in the estuarine you also have calcium concentration change, and also he somehow chooses to use different color scales, so you don't really see that exact comparison. But what's most interesting from his work is he has some pH measurement in 1980 and today, then some very mysterious pH data back in 1935 before the NBS scale was even adopted. Anyway, so there's a very nice decrease in the pH over this 70 years. And then he used a model because we have a lot more oxygen data. So he used this so-called AOU, apparent oxygen utilization data, to back calculate the history of ocean acidification in this estuarine, and or should we say acidification in this estuarine. So he back used this model to calculate the bottom water pH all the way to early 1930s. So again, it shows this nice pH decrease. And later when I show you the Delaware Bay result, we can also talk about this long-term trend. So then come down south a little, we have Gulf of May and the Mid-Atlantic Bight. And I'm sure Joe Salisbury and Alec Wang covered some of this in their talk. So you can go to look their listen their talk and read the paper led by Alec. But overall, I'm disappointed that we have not synthesized the abundant data available in the Mid-Atlantic Bight region, in particular the ocean OMP, the Ocean Margin Program data collected in between 1993 and 1996. They are very high quality inorganic carbon data from that program, and we could compare with more recent data to look at this long-term change. And I pointed that out for the last 10 years when I was remotely in Georgia. Now, of course, I have more interest to get into this. And then going to south, and for the South Atlantic Bight, there is two publications, one led by Li Qing Zhang, and that's all about the saturation state, and several us, of course, of that paper in limnology oceanography, and then this paper by Alec Wang again, and from this GOMEC cruise. It's a cruise from Gulf of Mexico all the way to May, occurred in the summer of 2007. And actually we had a GOMEC 2 in 2012. It would be really interesting to compare these and in the context of abundant early data. So I'm going to just quickly show this Gulf of Mexico situation. Here you see it becomes famous is because of this very high nutrient input into coastal ocean from satellite image here, and this hypoxia zone associated with eutrophication. And that, of course, is not the only example. Globally, these low oxygen events occurred everywhere almost. And what I show here is oxygen pH, DIC, alkalinity saturation state in August 2007. You can see in this northern Gulf of Mexico, this extended area of low oxygen, and correspond very well to that is this pH, and this is similar to that St. Lawrence estuarine. And you can see that is closely linked to the in situ release of DIC because there's no alkalinity change between August and May. So it's not an upwelling or it's not somewhere else. It really produced locally, and you can see there is a big decrease in the saturation state, but because of this very high initial saturation state, so that is not even below 1 yet, but you will see later that actually if we keep increased atmospheric CO2, by the end of this century, this whole area will be undersaturated. So anyway, we build a close link of this pH decrease to this oxygen consumption and CO2 release process, this respiration of organic matter. So I plotted pH to the oxygen consumption here, and so this is data from Gulf of Mexico of several cruises since 2006. We have almost all summer cruise all the way to this last summer, and this was made 3 years ago. Yeah, so okay, then I also brought in Changjiang, the Yangtze River situation. Here you see it's almost the same result followed that. And that actually they follow very well this simple model of ready-filled organic matter decomposition using oxygen to produce CO2. So how do anthropogenic CO2 and the CO2 from respiration interact in this case. Unfortunately, you couldn't immediately see that. This is just data. Like it shows the pH decrease with oxygen, and that seems just the respiration. But if we take a simple model approach, so we have a Gulf of Mexico offshore alkalinity and DIC data, and if we decrease that DIC to, you will have a lower PCO2. So if we bring that to the pre-industry level, let me close the door. So here's the notes. All right, so you will, if we hold alkalinity constant, use a CO2 system software, that's just easy to do, right? We hold alkalinity and reduce DIC a little bit, you got a PCO2 at around 280. Then we are adding this respiratory CO2 into the system. Then it follows this line, decrease oxygen and decrease pH. The same if we hold alkalinity constant and increase DIC to a PCO2 at about 800 ppm, and then you are adding CO2 using Redfield ratio of oxygen consumption, so you got this line. Now this is what you see, that at the full oxygen without respiratory CO2, the ocean acidification value is 0.11. That is what we all know in the open ocean. Uptake of CO2 has, anthropogenic CO2 has bring the pH down from pre-industry to today at about 0.1 unit. And then you can see this value in this low oxygen, high CO2 water. That high CO2 is added by this respiration process. And that ocean acidification effect between the pre-industry and today is 0.16. So there is this almost 50% increase. I'm just saying that roughly because this is a log unit. So it increased from 0.1 to 0.11 to 0.16. There is about 0.05 pH unit increase. The same will be true from today to end of this century. You will have 0.27 pH unit decrease in the oxygenated water and 0.4 pH unit decrease in the low oxygen water. Now again, this is in Gulf of Mexico water, and that water has a very strong buffer capacity. In other places, you will see even stronger pH decrease. So overall conclusion is there is this so-called enhanced ocean acidification or amplified ocean acidification because as respiration bring in CO2 introduced by respiration that decrease the buffer capacity of the seawater, and that give us this amplified or enhanced acidification. You can see it as the other way around, that the ocean acidification would amplify the biological signal of this 0.29 in the pre-industry time when you consume all the oxygen, release CO2, to today would be 0.34. That's again an increase of 0.05, and to the future to 0.47. That's an increase of 0.13 pH unit. So that is what I mean by enhanced acidification. And I try to explain a little bit why that is the case. So I plot here is the delta pH against this delta pH to delta DIC. So you add this amount of DIC, 100 micromole, for example, and how much of pH change it will give you. So in the pre-industry, it will decrease pH by 0.15, a little bit less than that. And anyway, when we increase CO2, either by adding anthropogenic CO2 or by adding respiratory CO2, this pH decrease will keep increase until at a point that this DIC equal to alkalinity. This is actually the set alkalinity I have is nearly 2400 micromole per kilogram. So there is this point that actually you will have a maximum pH change, and after that you will decrease that, have less effect. We are far away from that, but in the the area that oxygen is fully depleted and atmospheric CO2 at the end of this century, we will approach that point. All right, so that's a little bit of a theoretical explanation, and this is just try to show if we have the high PCO2 at the end of this century, the entire Gulf of Mexico area would be undersaturated to aragonite. So I want to now discuss how would we expect the CO2 system should respond to salinity change, temperature change, and river-ocean mixing with different alkalinity in the river, and adding to that the respiratory CO2. And I'm going to skip the nitrogen part. Actually, earlier I gave a talk about multiple stresses, so I still have that name here. So I would like to use a simple model, and that I call that model 1, to examine the impact of respiration on pH, PCO2, and omega under various conditions. So this simple model assumes initial partial pressure of CO2 and oxygen is set by atmosphere. Of course, that PCO2 increases, that means, and also it's set by the temperature, that's a solubility. And alkalinity is known for the river, so I use only one river, 1.0 micromole per kilogram, and the ocean end member is 2.3. Oh, sorry, it is millimole because of 1.0, 2.3, yeah, millimole per kilogram. Bottom water is no longer in contact with the atmosphere, and then this simple Radfield ratio metabolic process. Now later I will question this. This initial partial pressure of CO2 is set up by atmosphere, because in my early study with the Gulf of Mexico, salinity is over 30, so it doesn't really matter, and PCO2 there is pretty low. But in many of the estuarine, like PCO2 is very high, so could be a question here. So we will talk about a modification of that. So this is done by Bill Sander and with a little bit of contribution of myself. So we present here oxygen and the relative changing CO2 and pH, carbonate and saturation state. So initially you see this saturation state at a different temperature, 1, 10, 20, 30, and salinity. It's all controlled by Henry's law, the solubility constantly changes. So low temperature, you have a lot more oxygen, and high temperature less, and also fresh water has more oxygen. Now when it comes to CO2 increase, we put it relative, that is CO2 versus initial. This is really the effect on the respiratory driven CO2. So with this initial oxygen and initial CO2, then we say if all the oxygen is consumed, how much will the pH increase and PCO2 increase and pH decrease. So this is relative, that is a ratio of the the final pH after respiration to the initial value. Okay, so you can, the point here is with this different salinity 36 to 4, this range, you can see the greatest increase in relative CO2, that's about 13-fold, and decrease in pH, that's about 1.1 pH unit, occurred at low salinity and low temperature water. That means these water are less buffering. And at high salinity and temperature, less increase in this relative CO2, and it's more spread around, okay? Less increase in CO2 and decrease in pH. So instead of 1.1 pH unit in this side end, and we have 0.25 to 0.77 pH unit decrease at salinity 36. And you can see the carbonate decrease follows similarly in the low salinity and low temperature part. You have more carbonate concentration decrease, and at the high salinity part less, so from 12-fold to 1.2. All right, why there is such a big difference between low and high temperature and salinity? First, we may say there's higher solubility of gases in cold and less saline water, so you have a lot more oxygen here. Then, of course, by rate-fill ratio, you will release more CO2. But in this model, I assume that both oxygen and CO2 is set by the initial atmospheric level. So while you have a 2.3-fold increase in oxygen, we also have actually a large CO2 increase. So the result is not a big difference. You can see, this pH decrease between the red difference between the two red line and the two pink line is not greatly different. All right, and later on when we talk about that mixing only model, that model 2, then there will be a difference. This will be more apparent, more important, because in that case there's zero CO2, anthropogenic CO2 in the low salinity part. So here the big difference in this different initial carbonate is really responsible for the very different sensitivity to salinity and temperature. And of course, because our river has lower alkalinity, and at high salinity you have high alkalinity, and then really the most important is the change in the dissociation constant of this K2, which is a dissociation of bicarbonate into carbonate. So at a higher temperature and higher salinity, more bicarbonate is dissociated into carbonate. So the system have a much higher buffer capacity. All right. So then it would be really interesting to ask how will this respiration signal changes as the atmospheric CO2 keep increase in the future? Will it amplify or suppress this respiratory CO2 acidification or this delta pHR? So here we present two cases. One is at 3 degrees C. Actually, this is only seawater only. It's salinity equal to 35. So there's no fresh water mixed in, just for simplicity here. So we have two cases. The blue color represent a 3 degrees C case, and the red color 27 degrees C. So you have, when the PCO2 increase in the atmosphere, of course water CO2 increase in both the before respiration, and this is after full oxygen consumption. So there's this difference, we call that relative CO2 change or relative pH change. So it's that difference plotted here as delta pH. So let's focus here. You can see in the 3 degrees C case, there's initially an increase when you have this atmospheric CO2 increase. Initially there's an increased effect of this respiratory CO2, but very soon it reaches a maximum and then it starts to decrease. Now this is very different in this 27 degrees C water. Actually it keeps increase until a much higher atmospheric CO2 at 1,400. It reaches a maximum and then it starts to decrease. So why there is this big difference? Okay, so the lower temperature one, we still have much more delta pH change because this system is poorly buffered, and the high temperature one is much better buffered, all right, because of the K2 effect. But let's take a look about this. So actually the low temperature one would replace the Arctic water and water at the ocean oxygen minimum zone much better, and the high temperature salinity one will represent the Gulf of Mexico. But because our river, this is this seawater one actually, we'll get back to this with the mixing issue with the lower salinity. And here, the initial carbonate, again, is a key fact. So we want to talk a little bit about what is so magic about this point of maximum delta pH. This is really where the system has a minimum buffer capacity. And this is a point where alkalinity, DIC, increases to the same as alkalinity. Okay? A point where DIC equal to alkalinity, or now if we expand that definition, DIC is CO2 plus bicarbonate plus carbonate, and alkalinity is bicarbonate twice carbonate. And oh, I see I'm running out of time, so I'll speed up this. Anyway, if you cancel out a few terms, really this side is CO2, this side is carbonate plus borate. And these are all minus components. So you have this side, the base decreases and the acid increases. And the pH is really controlled by relative amount of both sides. So once you cross that, you have this very sensitive pH change. This is a weaks the buffer capacity of the system. So I'm going to move quickly. I think I'm going to almost skip this so-called second model that basically we see the ocean acidification signal is brought into estuarine via mixing of already acidified source water. So there's only zero ocean acidification signal in the riverside, and this is a model of the Altamaha River. So this side you see seawater buffer capacity decreases as it is diluted by low alkalinity river water. But in this side, it shows the amount of anthropogenic CO2 decreases as salinity approaches to zero. So there's one area, this so-called, what Xinping called that estuarine minimum buffer zone. And last night when I'm preparing this, I said maybe we can call that a maximum acidification zone, estuarine maximum acidification zone. And then Xinping went ahead to present 3 cases. This is Amazon pH in the mixing case, pH before oxygen consumption, anthropogenic CO2, and yeah, so this is at 2100, and this is pre-industry, and the difference is showed here. This is Amazon, and you can see this minimum buffer capacity zone or maximum acidification. Again, this side is because of the decreased buffer capacity, and this side is the decreased anthropogenic signal. And most interestingly here, you will see this minimum or buffer capacity or maximum acidification actually moves to high salinity when the river alkalinity increases from Amazon to St. John's River or Altamaha River, very similar, or Susquehanna River. You will all see a similar situation like this. When the alkalinity of river keep increasing, this will keep increasing until a point you will see no this minimum zone or maximum acidification zone, like in the Mississippi River case. You just see a monotonic decrease of this ocean acidification signal because it's mixed in and approached to zero. Okay, I'm going to skip this. All this says is when you add the CO2 from respiration, you got a similar minimum zone here in the Amazon and St. John's River, but not the Mississippi. I'm going to skip the rest talk. You can see that from these slides. Basically what my point is, contradiction to conventional wisdom that a storm could provide a mechanism to make your bottom water more acidic. That's because you can supply oxygen very quickly, but you can't get rid of CO2 very quickly. So you can supply oxygen for the next round of acidification, and if you have enough organic matter, so you can get a lower and lower pH. And the reason that is slow is, of course, bicarbonate buffering. And you can see the data we collect in Gulf of Mexico or in the East China Sea. These deviate from the main trend is all after a major storm. So summary, respiration often plays a more important role in acidified coastal bottom water today, but anthropogenic CO2 uptake from the atmosphere will play an increasingly important role in acidifying coastal water. And there is a strong enhancement of acidification in the CO2 enriched water, and such effect vary greatly with salinity and temperature, with a greater effect in low temperature and salinity water, and a smaller effect in high and temperature and salinity. And that is assuming the initial CO2 is set by the atmosphere, but if we assume this is only mixed in proportionally to salinity, then you would see an extreme maximum acidification zone. That is a zone you have lowest buffer capacity and maximum acidification. All right, if I have just a couple of minutes, I want to quickly to show you some Chesapeake Bay measurement. This is very high CO2. We have Delaware Bay and Chesapeake Bay. And this is August. We stayed on the Bay Bridge for several days. Actually, PCO2 goes down to less than 100 ppm, and with low pH and high oxygen in that area. And this is a depth profile. You see the oxygen goes to 0 and the pH decreases, but very interestingly, after oxygen consumed, you have a nearly constant pH, and we also have some kind of hysteresis effect. I don't know yet. We needed to have more data. And what it shows really, it's a mixing effect of this maybe hydrogen sulfide and some reduced species in this anoxic zone. When it's mixed up, it gets oxidized and produced very low pH. So the pattern of this pH to oxygen is very different from what you see in the Mississippi. That is because of two reasons. One, the water here already have a lower buffer capacity in both the ocean end and the river end compared with the Mississippi. So we start with much lower buffer capacity water, so pH is a lot lower. And then there is additional process. Here is dominated by oxygen respiration and a little bit of denitrification. And here we have all this low oxygen, anaerobic, suboxygen anaerobic process. And this is my last slides from the Delaware Bay, and we are fortunate to have this guy in this in the University of Delaware. He was a faculty here, Charles Curbison, and when I was a graduate student, read the 1980 literature. He was a big guy in CO2 chemistry, and he retired early, but he has this very high quality sets of pH data and collected, so I plotted a different season. And then the yellow data are our recent data from June, and the red is November data. You can see there are two big differences here. One is our current data has a lot of high pH in the low salinity zone and lower pH in the high salinity, and these are offshore data. So my only explanation so far without other geochemical context is there's a much improved water quality, less acid from the sewage in the low salinity in the river end, and this is partly ocean acidification effect, and partly because of less nutrient promoted biological production, so we have less pH, lower pH, sorry. All right, thank you. Sorry I took a little longer time.